All right, so we are on. So today's little presentation I have gotten set up, um, and we're going to have our little introduction soon after I get the first slide done. Whatever happened to Castlevania? So uh, Albeleo and I are basically guys who like monster films and media, and we're going to introduce ourselves in the next slide and how we got introduced to the Castlevania franchise. So, all right. So, who are you and how did you become interested, Albeleo?
Well, hello, I am Albeleo, and I think the first game I played in Castlevania was Simon's Quest, back when my brother and I had the classic NES.
Wow, that's farther back than I started. I mean, my first console I actually owned at home was somewhat of an inherited Nintendo 64.
Oh,
So
nice.
I mean, I borrowed the Super NES because apparently those cartridge systems can still be good for years if you take care of them. So I
Oh, yeah.
so this is like 2000, and I borrowed my friend's Super NES, and some of the games he had let me borrow with the console were Super Castlevania 4, which I later learned that's a remake of the original.
Hmm.
Only it's more, it's more stages and longer. So that was how I got started. I later tried when I got the PlayStation console to, or rather the PS2 to back play the older PS1 games because the PS2 had backwards compatibility.
Back
So
when that was still a thing.
that's how I got the Symphony of the Night disc working because PS2 plays PS1. That was the good gimmick that those old consoles had in the start of the 21st century. Play your old
It was
games.
nice.
So yeah, that's how I got started. It wasn't even the first one. I later went back because I have this preoccupation with trying to find the predecessors, and that's where I got started. So later I got the other ones for NES. I actually played them online because Facebook had let you play. Used to, I don't know if they still do. They let you play the old NES games back when Facebook was a new thing.
There are plenty of ways to still get a hold of of all kinds of games in browsers, and yeah, I never really got much into that. Uh, s- so I did Castlevania 2 because Simon's Quest and will always have a special place in my heart, especially since it came up with bloody tears.
Right.
uh, After that, I hadn't really touched Castlevania uh, shy of like Symphony and 64.
Yeah.
And then I just worked I much of it was trying to fill in the gaps as well because same thing with like Final Fantasy and whatnot. It's like I had 3, which is actually
Right.
6, obviously.
Yeah,
And it's just like,
that was
oh,
the big mistranslation. They sold it in English as 3, but it was actually number 6. They didn't release 3 until way later. The actual 3 in Japan until way later.
mhm.
And that's going to be another one of our topics later. Is we're thinking of talking about whatever happened to Final Fantasy is the next topic after Castlevania, of course, because this one's
Mhm.
going to take 2 or 3 parts. There's no way I can see of doing it that way. But
Yeah.
I'm going to put all 3 parts of Castlevania into one video with chapters so people can see the whole thing all in one after it's done. But yeah, I'm so I mean I that's how I got started is I played it in the browser. But the next one we're going to talk about is, some of the surprises we had at how certain features got started in Castlevania because a lot of them are older than we think. So this is the saga begins with the NES is the most commonly known one. Not as
Mhm.
many people know about the MSX PC or the Famicom.
Yeah, up until your video discussing the number of ports of the first one, I was like, wow.
Yeah, I
I didn't know
mean, there's
Vampire Killer was a
I'm
thing.
I'm gonna actually try to name all the Simon Belmont ones, and I'll see how well I can do. So there's Castlevania. There
Mhm.
is Castlevania 2: Simon's Quest that also stars him. Super
Yeah.
Castlevania 4 also stars him. Castlevania Chronicles stars him.
Mhm.
Uh, Trying to think if I can remember the other remake. Okay, he's not the star of Super Smash Brothers Ultimate in another fighting game, but he's in. So he's in a total of, yes, he's in Judgment too. So that makes 7. Thank you, Alvi. So there's 7 that star him, and it's closer to 10 if we actually get to Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. And another fighting game that I forget the name of it, that we don't know as much about because it wasn't on one of the bigger consoles. But he's the most common character in the whole franchise, which is fine because it's like he started it. So
yeah, shy of Dracula, Simon is, I think, fairly stated to be the herpes of Castlevania.
I sort of think of him as the way how Mario started Mario. I mean, they added in his brother Luigi for Super Mario Brothers plural, but there was arcade before that because they just needed a way of excusing a player 2, so they made Luigi. But Luigi has become his own character, thankfully, ever since the franchise started.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the crazy thing is, what I found out, and I found out after finally figuring out a way to get these games running, like Vampire Killer or Simon's Quest, finally, is that the features, the pseudo RPG features, aren't that new. They go way back in Castlevania.
It's astonishing how, like, and I understand fairly why Simon's Quest gets shit on because it has a lot of problems. You know, like a lot of the level design and the enemy placement is just terrible. But it's funny how much Simon's Quest, and to a lesser extent Dracula's Curse, but how much Simon's Quest is in the DNA of Symphony of the Night.
Oh yeah, Simon's Quest was the first time they had buying items from shops. I mean, it's easy because you don't really have that in the other games in between that and Symphony, but Simon's Quest was where it all got started. Now the second part is, Vampire Killer was MSX PC, and not many of us were familiar with MSX PC and tons of other consoles like 3DO or the various brands. X68000 by Sega. There's plenty of those. They didn't sell as well were as well known as the Nintendo and Sega consoles were, but Vampire Killer was when they started having the whole backtrack and find a key to unlock a door that you got in Symphony. And Vampire Killer was, it was on an MXX PC back in 1986, the same year as the first Castlevania was. Yeah, the whole thing wasn't that new.
Yeah.
And now we're still in the NES era. We're getting to Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. And I think what was special about that one, right?
If you're talking about the characters and the diverging pathways, yes.
Yes, exactly. You could swap characters, and that happens a lot in Harmony of Despair. I'm not fond of Harmony of Despair. It doesn't really have much of a plot to it. I mean, it can be a fun co-op multiplayer experience, but it's but the character swap thing was the interesting part about number 3. There's multiple ways to beat the game, or you can even just stage as Trevor being solo the whole time if you want.
Yeah. The original Dark Souls run, just muscle your way through all of Dracula's Curse with just Trevor.
Yeah, the OG Dark Souls right there.
Basically, especially that doppelganger fight.
Oh yeah,
it's so rough with Trevor. That's why it's part of the reason I always like Grant, and why I will always hate Netflix for what they did to Grant, because he's obviously, I know. Like, he was obviously supposed to be the priest that had a knife, and then I was like, oh, cool, he slashed his eye. He's a pirate. He. And then he killed it. I'm like, oh, no. No.
Yeah.
And then he never showed up for the rest of it, and I'm like, oh, God, why?
And the thing is that, and it's a lot of these modern films, like TV that they write, they just can't hold an attention because there's so much potential with Grant to have some kind of level of distrust. Sypha too. Is that there's so much potential for distrust and to try and build that cohesion over time with their team members because, okay, in the case of Grant, Alucard's dad killed killed his dad, right? So, like,
Mhm.
your father killed my father. How do I know you're not allied with your father? That kind of thing. And
Yeah.
with sci-fi, it's like I guess they changed what Trevor Belmont was, and and I'm going to get into the whole Lords of Shadow because a lot of the Netflix series seems to be trying to borrow from Lords of Shadow because in Lords of Shadow, like Trevor Belmont is Alucard. It's really weird, but the it's weird. We'll talk about Lords of Shadow way later, but
Yeah,
the whole
I
being
know.
rejected thing has to do with the fact that that Trevor's father became a vampire or became Dracula. So the whole my father is Dracula kind of works for making the Belmonts not be in good terms with the holy guys.
Mhm. Yeah, I not I don't obviously want to go crazy with like going down on
No. We need to
the
we're
Netflix
gonna have to
series, but
cover
man,
Super NES and Game Boy too today, so
yeah,
I won't
because
drag on too long.
yeah, I had already like plotted out in my head an entire like how they should have done just off of Dracula's Curse, the like a ten or 12 episode series for just Dracula's Curse, and it's just like how did you screw this up? But then again, they're not really fans over
Well,
at
like, and not just that, it's just the writing thing. People don't want to hold on to tension. I mean,
mhm,
yeah, I remember my wife and I were watching it back when we were newlyweds. We were watching Bones, and there was this total simp serial killer, computer hacker villain in the show Bones called Christopher Pillant. The thing that
okay,
made him such an interesting villain is that he escaped numerous times when they tried to get him, and they didn't. They were willing to keep the tension there that Pillant could do some kind of dick move to you when you're trying to get him. He was out there as an existential threat. And now in
mm,
modern writing, they just do this whole thing like Alucard says, well, they tried to kill me. And the gender swap grant they send there says, oh, that's no big deal. Like, really? You really
mhm,
want to just kill tension like the character already knows it, or the character is resolved with that problem right there. Like, why? I mean, I was raised on these 80s and 70s films like Jaws, and
mhm,
The first Jaws is great because you see bit by bit that this shark is smarter than you think a shark would be. Not to mention he's wearing away at your methods of trying to get him.
mhm,
So, I mean, I recommend the first Jaws, and I pretend like, well, aside from Michael Caine, I try to pretend that Jaws 4 doesn't exist.
pretty much. Even he does because he
Even
said in
he
an interview.
trolled. It
Yeah,
was fun. That interview was amazing because he's like, maybe.
like
He's
he
like, maybe. Maybe it
he
existed.
famously said that he hasn't seen the movie. He hasn't seen the movie, but he saw the house that the movie paid for. That's the whole reason he did it, and he didn't get to go and get his Academy Award or whatever at the time because he went to go and work on Jaws 4. He does not like it. Yeah, it's brutal. Also, hello Shadow, how are you doing?
So, yeah, that whole thing is where I'm going to kind of end our part with the NES era, and before we go into Super NES, it's just that it's the writing issue is that people don't want to keep tension. And as someone who's grew up on these older films like the original Jaws or Star Wars, it's just like tension helps. It helps you have a story that you can justify continuing because it's not resolved. Anyways,
Yeah,
so
don't get me
that's
started on tension
the
because man,
NES era.
Fallout.
Yeah, that's the same tension problem in that show in that series.
Yeah. Anyway, so the 90s.
Yes, and now we're in the Silver Age or the SNES. So yeah, that's when they started really, really remaking with Super Castlevania 4, which is, as I mentioned, how I got started with it, how I
Mhm.
introduced. Yeah,
Yeah, Castlevania 4 and everything within the SNES era was certainly a great refinement of classic of the original series and its formula.
I mean, it was a time where they could say like, "Hey, we can make games that are more than 1 megabyte now."
Yeah, back when they were still trying to figure out how to save space like the
Oh
way they
no,
did the
like
Zelda.
No, like they're doing all kinds of things to try and conserve space, like making the original Mario Kart. I mean, the developers at Nintendo literally went to watch NASCAR races and tried to like create a simple grid for the development of the game because they had so much data storage limitations at that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the
Obviously,
developers of the original Zelda, they actually designed all of the maps to fit together as perfect puzzle pieces because they thought that would save them space on the cartridge. That's how
well,
like
yeah, and there
that's
was limited
crazy how
color.
little people knew at the time.
That was limited colors too, because like in programming, like one of the key parts is the number of potential colors you're using in your scheme affects the data you're using up. So they limited the number of colors, obviously in the NES, but then they used more in SNES because they could finally have more data to their game.
Mm-hmm. So which of these three do you like? I'm obviously I have a bias towards Rondo. Rondo's I think the best one.
I mean, I prefer Rondo as well. I mean, at first I played the Dracula X for SNES, and then I really realized that Rondo was a little more should I say, complex, and it had a little more of the the save game mechanics. I just didn't have the Turbo GFX at the time, so I had to wait until I could unlock it in Dracula X Chronicles. But you can, I'll eventually do videos on showing how to unlock the game within a game, which
Mm-hmm.
is both Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night in Dracula X Chronicles, and that's what makes it an actual good remake of Rondo of Blood because you can unlock the older games in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my first Rondo was on the Wii because they put up the TurboGrafx for sale, or the like a bunch of the games through the Wii shop channel. So that
Yeah,
was
that
when
was a good
I
thing.
first ran into it, and I was just like, oh, that makes sense. I was wondering why this game sucked otherwise, because then you get
Yeah,
the original Japanese one, and you're like, oh, they just like rebuilt the game from the ground up.
right. And as I'm going to mention, this is part of these games we've covered so far in the Castlevania Remastered Collection, which is for everything, even
Mm-hmm.
for PC right now. So I'll later put a link in the description when we're done, just to let people know. Yeah, if you don't know, you can get these older Castlevania games as a remake and play them on your PC. It's that good. It's that convenient today, even for old games. Right now, we're in a good time. So the
Yeah.
next one we're going to get into is going to be the Game Boy, because we're not going to forget the Game Boy games that came out in the starting era. We're not going to forget them. So yes, the era of the Game Boy.
Yeah,
I didn't.
this was definitely rough.
I missed all of these. I didn't actually get them until I bought on Amazon. I bought the 301 classic Game Boy games and slipped it into a Game Boy Advance, which I regret. The one thing I regret so much today is that I didn't show my video of putting the Game Boy Advance. It's actually an SP Silver back together. So now I have essentially a Game Boy for less than the cost of what I would have to buy a full Game Boy on Amazon just by getting the parts and putting it together.
Huh.
It could have been a good video if I show myself putting it back together, but it is what it is.
It's funny. So I have played each of these a little bit. I whichever one I I actually have the because I have a ton of the physical cartridges all up here.
Yeah.
I've got a big collection on a like 8-foot shelf above me of NES through Wii and whatnot. I have Adventure. I have the first one because I was working as security at a Smash Bros tournament,
Oh yeah.
and I was walking around, and this it was called Smash and Splash. It was an old my old boss used to run it because he was I'll keep it short. He created a major for the Smash Brothers circuit and it became a national. It became huge, right? Because it was a
Right.
Smash Brothers tournament at a water park venue. So this was up in
Okay.
Wisconsin,
Oh, cool.
and I was walking around as security, and it's actually where I got my flat cap Doom hat, which is really nice.
Yeah,
And I was walking around to security, and I happened to look over, and I'm like, "Oh, they've got a lot of classic cartridges." And I see somebody flipping through a bunch of them, and I saw Castlevania, and I was like, "There's no way." So yeah, they were just like, "Yeah, $5." I was like, "Yoink!" So that's how I got my physical copy of Castlevania Adventure.
yeah. Works, I guess.
Mhm.
But I think the fun part is like the 301 Game Boy cartridge. I'm giving it one of my kids play it too. My boys play it too.
Uh-huh.
So I give him a Game Boy because I just can't stand the idea of giving him those tablets.
Oh
Play
god,
it,
no,
play it,
no,
play it,
no.
play a portable console like what your father used to play. That's all I'm gonna say.
Yeah, exactly. My lady and I, we wanna, like, raise the kids with at some point in the far future when we have them, we wanna raise kids on, like, the classics to get them to appreciate where things came from, and
That's what we're
then
doing right now.
introduce. Yeah.
I mean, we're not doing so much the tablets right now, but we're letting them play. The Nintendo Wii, and I've got the Game Boy Color thing, and I'm playing it Nintendo DS, which I just had to replace a bad part in it, and it runs just fine. So we've got consoles, and that's our main idea. Is we'd rather let them play consoles and not get lost on tablets and the whole online world. That's just our choice. That's our
Yeah, it is the
choice.
first one. It is the first one I've got. That's what I thought. Yeah. But yeah, no, I absolutely. I don't. I'm not a big fan of tablets myself, and after having seen my brother having to repair multiple through his years growing, raising his kids,
Oh yeah,
I'm just like, no, I'm good.
yeah. No, it's fine. So yeah, we'll go to the Game Boy one. So there's Castlevania Adventure, Castlevania 2, Belmont's Revenge. That's a rare one because it's a case of a Belmont from Adventure. Christopher has to go back and help his own kid. That's really rare. I don't recall much happening much. I mean, I guess Portrait of Ruin is the reverse with Jonathan, but we'll talk about that next episode. But because that's Ega era. But yeah, it's a rare case of where the parent gets to be involved with their child in the same game, and when the protagonist is older too. I mean,
Hmm.
Soleil is obviously, I believe it's like 17, 18 in that one. So I mean, Christopher is most likely in his late 30s or 40s, depending on how old he was when Soleil was born.
Hmm. Yeah, because
So
it's a mix. I think it's because it conflicts with Just's game is why they ended up getting rid of those first two of the Game Boy because uh
oh,
where was it? Because Just is before Richter.
you're
Richter
right.
is
Juice is if Juice were still alive in Rondo of Blood, he would be like 62 years old.
yeah.
So Christopher was, I think Christopher might have actually been before Simon though.
It should be Trevor, Simon, Christopher,
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Just, and then Richter.
Oh, yeah. Let me see.
I,
I'm
I'm
actually
I'm
gonna
I'm
take a look.
so confident that's the case because the other reason why the trilogy as a large got removed is because of Sonya because that
Right,
conflicted with
but
things and
the big thing with Sony though is it goes against the idea of lament of innocence. The second one is the fact that at the end of the game it says that Sonya's kid is also Dracula's kid, meaning that Alucard is the father of her child.
yes, which goes against your character because
Well,
you
I
know
mean it depends. I don't have a firm stance either way. I mean we could talk more about it in the Iga era because that's where
sure sure
the ideas come in. But I mean, I don't know. I just don't have a solid stance. Let's see. Late
I think Nocturne of Reflection is like the nail in the
It's
coffin, as it were.
it's really it's essentially romantic comedy type drama,
Yeah,
which it's not my cup of tea, so to speak.
sure.
I mean, I'm not interested in seeing these characters like Alucard. Like, I don't know how to reciprocate my emotions very well. I'm stuck with, oh no, I'm going to kill this guy because he made a threat about Maria, and so on and so on.
You could tell the people on the show we're definitely not fans of Castlevania like we are, because if they had known anything about Nocturne of Reflection, they definitely would have done that to Adrian, because I was just like, no, I've seen this before. Breathe.
I don't know. Like, I mean, it didn't really need to happen. I mean, I feel that
never did.
I feel that there's various details in the games that can be taken one way or another, and those are enough. I mean, the whole picture of it, like Alucard sitting there mourning, it being the official picture for Eric Licard, and we're going to talk more about the Ega era of Fortune of Ruin, but that says enough. I mean, it's someone who, for whatever reason, we don't know why Alucard became absent, but it's someone who took up his spot, and he's dead. So Alucard's going to be sad about that no matter what.
Yeah, they should have just stuck with the Vampire Hunter D characterization, where he's just scared of what he can do to others.
To an extent, it works, but to an extent, it doesn't, because in Vampire Hunter D, you don't have this intermittency when monsters are relatively gone, and that's what we're going to talk about more with the Ega era, is because the Ega era it's very anti-war. It's very incredibly. It has a lot of things that a lot of audiences, I feel, don't understand about anime. And another place that's really anti-war is Studio Ghibli. Those are another case of their films where the point is both sides are essentially not that great off because they're fighting with each other. It's unnecessary. So I think that's a good part. But yeah, the other thing that Castlevania Legends had was they tried to squeeze it in as the last Game Boy game before Game Boy Color came in 1998.
Mm-hmm.
So it was on the really tail end of one of the last old Game Boy games that they had coming in. So, and that's part of the problems. It won't be the last one either.
Yeah, it's funny too, because like I have the Super Game Boy.
Oh,
so
yeah?
I'm not worried about it not being in color.
How was the Super Game Boy system? I never quite got to that one.
The Super Game Boy,
plug it into your TV, right?
So the Super Game Boy is it's an adaptation cartridge. So you put the Game Boy cartridge into the Super Game Boy, and then the Super Game Boy goes into your Super Nintendo.
Okay.
And so you hit L and R, and it pops up a menu that allows you to change the entire color scheme from the original through like 12 different presets. You could change the background, because obviously, so they didn't have a proper scaler for dropping. So like the quality is great, right? Especially back then on the CRTs.
Right.
But the Game Boy games won't quite fill it out. So they actually have borders around it that you can do. There's a bunch of presets, like there's a sign in the woods or a movie theater. There's a bunch of those. And then there's just a flat blank one that you can just draw around in like it's Mario Paint.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there's all kinds of... If you ever get a chance, just look up the videos of that, and it's just like, oh, wow, that's... you got to play like all the Game Boy games on the big screen. Obviously, because it's a cartridge, you couldn't like trade Pokemon or anything if you wanted to, but you could still play the game, have the Pokemon for later, and then just pop it into the Game Boy. Back when Nintendo actually, cared.
Yeah, they actually cared. Yeah, before the dark times, before the Empire.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's coming it, and now we have a lot, so we can open it and talk more about answering questions at this point, if you in the audience have some. But this is the last 15 minutes or so.
Yeah, sure. Will Bloodlines be held at a later time?
Yes, I'm putting in. I realized with Bloodlines being more connected to Portrait of Ruin as a direct sequel, I feel it fits in better. So that's why I edited it into part 2 as a presentation.
Mm-hmm.
because Bloodlines is based on a lot of assumptions that got retconned with the Iga era and Symphony of the Night. The entire assumption in Bloodlines, or even before Symphony of the Night, was that Alucard was dead. They did that in the Choose Your Own Adventure book called Legend of Satanic Castle, where they assumed Alucard was dead, and he had his daughter or granddaughter, whatever it is, named Layla, taking his spot. And Eric Licard takes his spot. I don't know why, because he's absent. We'll never know. We'll most likely never know why Alucard's absent for so long. Is he dead again? I don't know. I don't know. But whatever the reason for it is, Eric is his designated replacement, just like Jonathan or John. I keep getting John and Jonathan mixed up. Forgive me. The way John Morris is the fill-in for the Belmont.
Mm-hmm.
So, his designated inheritance is the Licard family, which is funny because Licard is also Dracula in reverse. It's in Romanian. It goes, if you spell it in reverse, it's E-Drac-L, which is Romanian for he is the devil. So it's another reverse Dracula name with Licard.
Interesting.
Yeah. I was surprised I didn't think of it being that way, but Licard does sound similar to first. So yeah, it's another Dracula in reverse, because it's a way of saying that they're filling in for Alucard.
and the Belmonts at the same time. That's pretty clever.
Yeah. Well, they did Morris because it's the Dracula novel is supposed to be semi-canon to Castlevania, and as what happened in 1897.
Mm-hmm.
Because 1897 is 100 years after Symphony. So yeah.
Yeah, interesting. Well, which of the classic three is your favorite?
Oh, my favorite? I'm gonna say it's actually the first. It's actually the first one. I do like the whole character swap and multiple paths, but I really enjoy going to the first one. And even while Castlevania 4 is interesting, how you have the multi-directional whip, it kind of takes out the reason for having the sub weapons almost, because the whole reason the original one to use sub weapons is because your whip only goes one direction. So if you want to hit someone above you, you throw an axe or holy water, or if you want to have a barrier in front of you while you're intermittent with your whips, you throw the holy water and the flames, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
But I still enjoy Super Castlevania 4. It's just something that had the added mechanics like the swinging on the whip or hitting the switches with the whip and so on. Because that was something really that added to what you got in the original game at the same time.
I wish they had designed more around the whip, because the whip is like 25% of the screen or something like that. The calculations are crazy. It's like 256 pixels is the it's like 256 by 244 is the pixel ratio is the pixel resolution for the Super Nintendo, and the whip is like 60 pixels. So you're just like, well, all right, anything and everything. Yeah. But that's why on the stream when I did Super Castlevania 4, that like all the way up until when did I start to have trouble? Like death.
I think it was right.
It was something like that, but that's because Gaben is a joke, but Slogra has that really goofy hitbox where he'll hit you without having hit you. But pretty much everything up until that point is kind of a joke, because the whip is so strong.
Right, and it gets even easier in the case of death, because you can hold up the whip. And the whip in Super Castlevania 4 acts like a shield because you're holding it up. So it will literally stop the sickle attacks. Not the big one, but the little sickles that he throws at you when he's flying.
Yeah. And as soon as I think it was you and I remember if it was Shadow too, but you and a few others also pointed out, like, hey, get behind the thing. And I was just like, oh, all right. Well, that fight became an easy thing too.
Yeah. Yeah. It's those little tricks or those little glitches in the game that make it much, much easier.
Yeah, and I really wish I really do wish Rondo had done more in depth, but they were trying to stay so focused on the classic era. My
They were.
my man, it's so funny. My buddy, so back when I had my apartment, my buddy came over and he and I both like challenging games, but he's not
Right.
so much a retro gamer.
Oh yeah.
And so like he's gone through and done like Resident Evil 4, like the Resident Evil 4 remake on hardcore and all kinds of other stuff. So like he's good at gaming. Don't get me wrong. But I sat him down to play Rondo, and for some reason he could it's like it's an inside joke all these years later because the crows on the way into the castle were screwing with him so hard. They actually
Oh,
they
when you're
killed him.
trying to cross the bridge to get
Yeah.
to the clock tower with the net, I remember that.
No. He on the way into the castle.
Oh, okay.
Before you even get chased by Behemoth, he he couldn't deal with the crows because it's such a different
Oh,
style of gaming. And
right.
so I put him through like the Dark Souls run of classics pretty much, shy of like the original trilogy. And then he was not prepared for the shaft fight because he never because it's what,
Right,
4
because it's
bosses?
yeah, it's there's the 3 ones you have,
Yeah, the
the
Bat,
Frankenstein monster,
Medusa,
Medea,
Frankenstein,
and
and
then
then
Shaft.
Shaft. And you have to do all of this on 1 health bar. He
Yeah.
wasn't ready. He actually got really snippy with me while I was just trying to just, like, casually talking. He's like, "I know."
At least Rondo, the actual Rondo was the first one you could save your game.
Yeah, yeah.
And at least it helped me out because when I finally got around to Dracula X Chronicles, I didn't have enough time in one city to do it. I mean, I was busy with life,
Yeah,
school and whatnot, work,
sure.
school, my job and whatnot. So, all
And
right.
yeah, and
Yeah,
yes,
go ahead.
Shadow 3DS and, the Super Game Boy, they are awesome. I still absolutely, I agree. I just wish the 3DS wasn't dropped, but I keep forgetting that thing's, like, 10 years old now, so it's like, ugh.
Yeah, but the cartridge system, Shadow, those things can go for a long time if you like make sure they don't get too dusty. They will work for decades. I'm not kidding.
Yeah, when I collected all of the old cartridges that I have, I also got the, right screwdriver to take them apart, and I went
Right,
through and cleaned up all of them. I bought a new laser for my PS1 because I have the Gen 2, the one that doesn't have
right.
the composite in the back, and then
Yeah.
my brother helped me to replace the connector for the NES, and everything works great. It's amazing what an eraser can do because that's all you
No,
need.
right. I actually replaced the Nintendo Wii, and that thing's 2008. That's how old it is.
I
Because it
know.
was actually my wife's, and she brought it into our marriage. But so we have our kids use it. But all it took with the Nintendo Wii was we needed the laser projector
Uh-huh.
replaced. That's it, and that was like $60. And how much does that compare? Just $60 for a new laser lens compared to an
Mm,
entire console now. That's cheap.
yeah.
Yeah. But otherwise, it's been a great
Oh,
time. It's
oh,
been a
that
really great time.
that's a shame, Shadow.
I get rid of all my retro consoles besides the DS to save space. I mean, if it works, it works. I mean, DS can still play like Game Boy Advance on it, from
Hmm.
what I remember.
I'm very glad I'm very glad that the Switch does have uh not only a lot of the retro games, but they also added in the Game Boy stuff. So you can actually play like Metroid 2 and I think last time I looked, they
Right.
have like the first
I
of
looked.
the three.
Yeah, no, I actually looked at it. They've got the emulator options. You can buy an NES emulator for the Nintendo Switch store, and you
Yeah,
can get a Sega Genesis emulator. Various emulators for the Switch store.
yeah.
Ninte-
So the Sega,
Nintendo, obviously, but it works.
yes, but the Sega has Bloodlines in it.
Yeah, it does.
The Game Boy has at least the first Castlevania. The NES has all three, and then the Castlevania 4 is on the Super. So they have. I think
Then there's
there's
the Remastered Collection,
64.
which is for everything, including
Yeah, yeah.
PC.
And I think they have the six. I think the original 64 is in their 64 one. I don't think Legacy of Darkness is. I'd have to look it
Right.
up.
And we're going to talk about it next time as we're transitioning to EGA, how Legacy of Darkness was the early Game of the Year gimmick because they were in a real rush, because they were in a rush to finish Castlevania 64, but the team's intended game was Legacy of Darkness because Legacy of Darkness goes into why Dracula's back in 64. But yeah, they couldn't finish it because they had a rush schedule with the new they were changing producers because 1999 was when they were switching over to Koji Igarashi as the producer of the Castlevania franchise. So there was a rush,
Hmm.
and Koji Igarashi was like, "Okay, you know what? Just give me just put out the full game, and I'll be good with it." And that's where they got Legacy of Darkness.
Yeah, I'm I had not really known until within the last few years, so like relatively recently, like how crazy the development was rushed because I didn't know that they had no idea how to do anything 3D at the time.
Right. I mean, you're talking about what is it? It was Ocarina of Time, the original release of that, just come into 1998.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm trying. Metal Gear Solid was 1998, and it wasn't the first Metal Gear, but it was the first time they tried being 3D with Metal Gear. Uh, so there was a big rush, and some people did well at it, like the games like Croc or Mario 64, and others, or Crash Bandicoot. Others not
Hmm.
so much. And I'm going to go into my recommendation episodes with more of those games like Crash Bandicoot next time,
Hmm.
just because it was a crazy mess. There was a lot of hits and a lot of misses during the late '90s, and they were trying to go 3D in that time.
Yeah, because you had the games that tried to stay like true to relatively simple designs, and then you had games that tried to mess around with physics really oddly, which
Right.
some kind of worked and some didn't. Like Glover.
Yeah, I
Glover was
mean,
interesting.
right in the late '90s, a big thing that when it came to physics was a modified Quake engine. Essentially, that's how they
Yes.
build the Half-Life games. A
Hmm.
modified Quake, because other attempts with different engines, such as System Shock 2, which I enjoy a bit, not as much as the first System Shock, but yeah. Um, so yeah, I admit we're running low on time, but there's going to be a part 2 and 3 that Albeleo and I are going to schedule for a later time at around this time too, and I will compile all 3 parts into one big video when we're done with it, and hopefully state this what happened will be a nice series about looking at the past of video games. So thanks for stopping by, Albie, and hope you have a
Of
nice
course.
time.
Of course. Anytime.
So we'll be back here again, similar time of day, same channel.
All right. Thank you very much. And have a good day, Shadow. Thank you for stopping by, buddy.
Thanks, Shadow. See ya.